Hello and welcome to episode 114. Like the last episode, this one covers not one, but two books. However, it's time to cover a very different author for the first time. George R.R. Martin is easily one of the best known, most successful and wealthiest genre writers still working today, albeit slowly. While Martin is a giant of modern fantasy writing, even some of his ardent fans may not be aware that he first made an impact in science fiction. This episode first covers his debut novel from 1977, Dying of the Light. It's a gloomy, mournful story of lost love and personal obligations set on a dying rogue planet. Next, I'll take a look at the very different Tuf Voyaging from 1986. A more light-hearted affair, it collects 7 stories of eco-engineering, monstrous creatures, witty dialogue, and cats. Before the episode begins in earnest, a quick announcement. You may notice that there's a new feature to the podcast. By following a link in the episode description, it's now possible to send a text to the show. It's a way to get in contact with me directly, and I'd love for you to use this method to share what you think of the episodes and the topics I cover. Why not give it a try? Few science fiction and fantasy writers can really be thought of as household names, but George R.R. Martin definitely qualifies. His as yet unfinished epic fantasy series, A Song of Ice and Fire, has sold over 90 million copies, and its TV adaptation was an international phenomenon in its own right. Martin has been called the American Tolkien, and is almost synonymous with the fantasy genre. What even some of his fans may not realise, though, is that Martin was originally successful in the field of science fiction. Between 1971 and 1986, Martin published 26 shorter works of SF, which all formed a part of a single setting, which he called The Thousand Worlds. In this loose future history, humans have achieved interstellar travel and have colonised numerous planets. However, due to the vast distances involved and the impact of conflict, humanity is splintered into various disparate cultures. Many of the stories explore the differences between these societies, as well as with other forms of life. They range quite widely in style, from the military SF of The Hero from 1971 to the horror of the 1980 novella Night Flyers. Here we explore the only 2 full-length works in the Thousand Worlds setting. The first is the novel Dying of the Light from 1977, Martin's debut novel set on the declining rogue world of Warlorn. The second is Tuf Voyaging from 1986, a collection of stories featuring the eccentric trader Haviland Tuf. Together they're an interesting insight into the neglected SF works of an author who would become a dominant force in fantasy. After the Festival, Dying of the Light from 1977. By 1977, Martin had already published a number of stories in his Thousand Worlds setting, and it made sense that his first full-length novel would also form a part of it. Originally it was serialised in Analog Science Fiction and Fact between April and July 1977. In the SF Masterworks edition of Dying of the Light, Martin's friend and collaborator Lisa Tuttle provides a useful introduction which explores its place in his career. She describes the novel as an apprentice work, and as the last gasp of the author's youthful, romantic period. Certainly there's a pervasive theme of endings and change in this book. Dying of the Light opens with a lyrical description of the planet Warlorn, which for hundreds of years existed on the edges of human awareness. A rogue planet hurtling through space without a star of its own, it was a useless rock. Only when it came into the orbit of the red star called Fat Satan, and its hell crown of orbiting smaller stars, did Warlorn become of real interest. For 10 years it hosted a massive festival organised by representatives from 14 human worlds. But when the novel begins, the festival is long over, the planet is leaving the stars behind, and it has become a dying world. The main character is Dirk Talarian, a resident of the advanced and civilised planet of Avalon. He travels to Warlorn at the behest of an old flame, the ecologist Gwen Delvano. Since their time on Avalon, Gwen has become the Bithane or held wife of Jan Vakari, a member of the ritualized backwards culture of High Kavalar. Jan, in turn, is bound by tradition to another man, Garst Janacek, his blood brother or Tain. These and other complex Kavalar relationships play out against the backdrop of a doomed planet. Dying of the Light is a rather gloomy, mournful novel. It's the elegy for the planet Warlorn, for the abandoned cities built for the long-ended festival, for the love between Dirk and Gwen, and for the cruel, ossified culture of the Kavalar. All of these disintegrating elements are lit by the receding stars of the Hellcrown, which shine more dimly on the planet with each passing day. The story has a fairly tight focus, revolving as it does around 4 characters closely bound by love, tradition, and obligation. They live a lonely life, surrounded by 14 abandoned and mostly decaying cities. Martin spends much of the first half of the novel outlining the unique astronomical conditions of Warlorn, the relationship between Dirk and Gwen, and the intricacies of the Kavalar culture in which women are essentially regarded as property. During this phase, Dirk solidifies his view of the situation, which is strongly challenged by the faster-paced and more engaging events of the second half. This results in a real change in the way both Dirk and the reader views the status quo on Warlorn, which is perhaps the novel's major strength. Dying of the Light rarely approaches the excitement or economy of Martin's short fiction from this era. The first half certainly feels overly drawn out. Tuttle is right to identify the book as an apprentice work, but it has a uniquely elegiac feel, which gives it a distinctive identity both within Martin's bibliography and in the context of 1970s American SF. The Power of the Ark, Tuf Voyaging from 1986. Released by Baen Books in February 1986, Tuf Voyaging is a collection of 7 stories which were originally published between 1976 and 1985. 6 of them were published in Analog Science Fiction and Fact. The exception is the earliest story, A Beast for Norn, which was published in the anthology Andromeda 1. Often, Tuf Voyaging is referred to as a fix-up novel, but really it's better thought of as a set of linked stories. At no point does it coalesce into anything as coherent as a novel. While the style of the stories varies, the series as a whole was intended by Martin as a kind of homage to Jack Vance. This is particularly evident in the dialogue of the distinctive main character. Haviland Tuf is a peculiar kind of space trader operating between the far-flung planets of the Thousand Worlds. He's extremely tall, overweight, verbose, and self-regarding. He views himself as an honest dealer, frequently disappointed by the unreliability and rudeness of those he encounters. He also has a passionate love of cats. The book opens with The Plague Star, which was the first of 4 Tuf stories Martin published in Analog over the course of 1985. The story has some similarities with Night Flyers, in that it's about the struggle to control a starship. Here, the ship in question is the Ark, the last remaining siege ship of the Ecological Engineering Corps and a relic of a vanished empire. Ultimately, Tuf ends up in possession of the vast vessel, which has technology that makes possible almost godlike feats of eco-engineering. Using its stores of exotic DNA and its huge synthesis tanks, the Ark can be used to produce and propagate any number of plants and animals sourced from many of the Thousand Worlds. This elevates Haviland Tuf from being a mere space trader to a freelance eco-engineer who plies his trade with various planets that request his formidable services. To do this, though, they must grapple with his often infuriating personality. The stories are a mixed bag, but the strongest ones generally having been written later. The second story to be written, Call Him Moses, from 1978, is a rather clunky transposition of the plagues of Egypt from the Book of Exodus into an SF setting. Guardians, from 1981, is much stronger, a tale of monstrous sea creatures battling in the waters of the ocean world Namor. In 3 stories, Tuf has a recurring engagement with the planet Sut Lam, which is in an existential struggle with overpopulation and religious strictures. Haviland Tuf is the binding agent of Tuf Voyaging, and arguably its strongest aspect. His dialogue is frequently humorous, as are the responses of those who are forced to deal with him. The strange creatures concocted on board the Ark are another highlight of this varied and inventive collection, a fairly slight but always entertaining body of work. Thanks for listening to this episode. You can find more of my writing in text and audio form at my site andyjohnson.xyz. You can also find me on Twitter at AndyJohnsonUK, and you can support me at patreon.com/AndyJohnson. Catch you next time.